Hello. So today we're going to be talking about Irene McKinney's poetry collection, 6 O'Clock Mine Report. And I'm joined today for an interview by Andi Stout. So Irene McKinney is one of West Virginia's most significant poets, possibly the most significant poet, depending on who you ask. And so Andi's going to help me talk about Irene McKinney's work because Andi is also a West Virginia poet. Her first collection of poetry, entitled Tiny Horses Don't Get a Choice, was Pushcart nominated, and that's a book that explores the contemporary experience of being an Appalachian writer and the contemporary transitions that Appalachian culture is going through. So she has some great insight into Irene McKinney, who was a sort of earlier generation of West Virginia writer. So first off, Andi, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to start out, actually, I'm going to ask you to read one of Irene McKinney's poems. I'm going to ask you to read Twilight in West Virginia, 6 O'Clock Mine Report, which of course is the poem that gives the collection its title.
Twilight in West Virginia, 6 O'Clock Mine Report. Burgoo Mine number 3 will work. Burgoo Mine number 3 will work tomorrow. Console number 2 will not work. Console number 2 will not work tomorrow. Green soaks into the dark trees, the hills go clumped and heavy over the foxfire veins at Clinchfield, One Go, Greenbrier. At Hardtack and Amity, the grit abrades the skin, the air is thick above the black leaves, the open mouth of the shaft. A man with a burning carbide lamp on his forehead swings a pick in a narrow corridor beneath the earth. His eyes flare white like a horse's, his teeth glint. From his sleeves of coal, fingers with black half-moons, he leans into the tipple over the coke oven, staining the air red over the glow from the rows of fiery eyes at Swago. Above Slipjohn, a 6-ton lumbers down the grade. Its windows curtained with soot. No one is driving. The road gets lost in the clotted hills, in the blue spruce maze, the red cough, the Allegheny marl, the sulfur ooze. The hill cuts drain. The road gets lost and drop at the edge of the strip job. The fires in the mine do not stop burning.
All right, so now in light of that poem and some of the imagery we have and the things that it brings up, can you give us a sort of broad overview of West Virginia poetry or Appalachian poetry since, say, the end of World War II?
So I think there's a bit of a shift in the way that we're looking at things in poetry, the way we're writing in poetry in Appalachia. So initially it's this communal effort, everybody on the same team, everyone on board, union heavy. And then we get more and more of these, more and more destructive industry coming in. And then with that comes the erosion of workers' union, labor's unions, and things like that. And that creates an entirely different cultural shift in West Virginia. And writers write what we know. And I think what we can really see in Irene McKinney's poem, 6 O'Clock Mine Report, the Twilight in West Virginia, is the beginning stages of that shift, right? So she was born in the late 1930s. Most of her memories, early memories, are going to come from the 1940s. She's living through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. This is the height of her memory, right?
Yeah.
And so she can see this transition and this shift happening, and we see that coming through in the poem when we start with the imagery of the laboring men who are down in the mine with their pickaxe, right, with their picks. And then we move to another stanza and we see those men aren't there anymore. Instead, we have something automated coming through. We've got this car coming through, the continuous miner in this case. And no one's driving. And then finally, this last image that we're given with the mining operation, now it's a slip job. So I think that succinctly...
Can you tell us what that is, for those of us who don't know?
So that's the part where we lose our mountains, essentially. This is where we're not necessarily going inside anymore, we're sort of taking things down.
Okay, so like strip mining,
Yes,
mountaintop
exactly.
removal, this type of thing. Okay.
Exactly. So we're seeing that shift come through in one of McKinney's poems, and it's the first one we get right out of the gate. And that's important too, the position of that poem in the collection. That now sets a tone.
Okay.
That there's going to be a kind of internal and external struggle. Internal with the self and our self-identity, which creates this kind of fracture, which is now, I would say, prominent and necessary in Appalachian voices. It's something very distinct to us that makes us different or separate from, let's say, Southern writers.
Okay.
It's one of those distinctive factors. We sort of sit between two lines. We don't quite fit anywhere. There's this kind of fractured space that we live in, and it takes root in our writing too. You can see all of that, whether it's coming through poetry, whether it's coming through fiction, whether it's coming through song. These fractures exist.
Okay.
Through the identity and through our relationship with our own communities.
So is it fair to say that that Appalachian poetry, sort of broadly conceived, is in the same vein as other types of sort of labor-oriented poetry, but with that distinct sort of home orientation?
Yeah, so that's where the regionalism comes in, right?
Okay.
So yes, we identify with labor poetry and those sort of movements, but then we also have this extra little complication to our identity that in some cases creates a bit of a chip on our shoulder, and we're very slow to warm up, so you kind of have to work through the puzzle,
Okay.
essentially.
So I had mentioned this, that Irene McKinney is definitely one of the most important West Virginia poets, if not the most important modern West Virginia poet. And you've hinted at this a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about McKinney's place in that sort of story of modern West Virginia or Appalachian poetry?
Well, she was our poet laureate, our state poet laureate for a long time, so that says a lot about the identity and representation of Appalachia. And she's someone who is witnessing this shift from the union aggressive, workers union aggressive, labor union aggressive sort of stance and communal living, and then seeing this kind of shift throughout. And I think one of the things that really got her writing, and she's quoted in different ways in different spaces about this, is she said what really astonished her was when people talked about West Virginia, when they talked about Appalachia, they talked about it as backward. And she was astonished, right? She's like, what are you talking about? I had access to schools with good teachers that cared. I have access to nature and writing. What is backward about this? So I think part of her motivation here was to change the narrative, to take command of the narrative, because if you don't write your story, someone else will, and you might not agree with it. And she said, one of the things that she's noted for saying is she self-identifies as a hillbilly. And she says, I'm a hillbilly, I'm a woman, and I'm a poet. I don't listen to these things, right? So I might as well just say whatever I want, however I want to say it, because no one's listening anyway. And I think that's what she did.
Okay. So, just to follow up on that a little bit, a lot of non-West Virginians, non-Appalachian people, the term hillbilly conjures a particular set of images of Uncle Jed sitting on the porch with a jug of moonshine and a straw hat and whatever. So, but that's not what McKinney means, is it?
No. I mean, I think she understands or understood that stereotype, and that's what it is. It's a stereotype.
Yeah.
Didn't agree with it and said, no, here's actually what we are. I think probably the term redneck is a closer identifier, which also
Right.
has negative connotations. But in the state, you take West Virginia history, you're required to take West Virginia history throughout K through 12, right? You'll have it at least once in elementary school, again in middle school, and again in high school, and if you choose, you can take 2 or 3 in college, right? So you can't get away from who we are and what we come from. So I think what we know redneck to mean is union sympathizer, right? There are these men who go into the mines. They wear red bandanas around their necks to protect their face and their lungs from the coal dust. This is an unspoken symbol that says, I'm a labor union supporter, I'm a sympathizer, right? This is how you communicate to each other, because if you talk about unionization, it can get you killed, right? So that's a problem. So you need a new way to kind of speak in code. So it's a kind of code to figure out who belongs, right? Who you can trust, who you can talk to. And like I said, trust is a really big issue. And even when it comes to the page. And you can see that in Irene McKinney's work, in the way that she talks about even love, romantic love. There are poems where she's talking about sex. It's not lofty, it's not flippant, she's not seduced, right? There's still kind of a kind of awareness from the speaker that says, while I'm in this moment and I'm fully present and participating in this moment, I'm not seduced. This is not lost on me. I haven't lost my marbles. I'm not going to bow down into a box.
Okay. So I want us to kind of switch gears a little bit now and start talking about some of the other themes that are heavily present in McKinney's work. And so I'm going to ask you to read another one of her poems, Starlings in the Walls at Night, and we'll talk about some of the themes we see there.
Starlings in the walls at night. A hunger like morning waking has entered with the wind from the chimney and hovered over the dead fire. It wants to come out somewhere, some opening, any chink of entry. Driven this way, the lice on its wings are agitated, believing the starling has gone to sleep, moving toward the eyes. For a moment, the starling is tranced, believing that too. The lids of thin leather flicker and close for an instant, and then it drops, shuddering in the walls. Below it, beside it, I'm burrowing through the dark of my half-sleep, half listening to the wind take the loose boards again, knowing that the birds are passing through, around the frayed wiring, scratching at the chimney fissures, leaving lice and droppings in a scramble to find out exactly where they are. And I get up, as I have done for many nights, entered from within and without, having become a place of many crossings. Thread paths of bird track, bat weave, spider center, moth goal, no outside lights, and so they flock to the windows. Neglected porch and flaking wood tells them no one's there, but I am, like a seed hidden inside the garden, here for many months to get away. There are 6, 7 starlings now, the feathers sifting in the walls, the old bones gathering webs and soot. I'm standing in the middle of the room. My feet chilling on the bare boards, birds in my blood, on my hair, the sound of straw and sticks and nesting, and I am tranced. I'm populated to choking. The work and friends I have left to be alone are nothing to compare with this weaving of scuttering lives, these creatures unsymboled, emerging from the earth and air to take their place wherever there's an opening, any size or shape. And morning comes to generate more eggs and seeds.
So in that poem, there's a couple of things, obviously, that are really significant. But I asked you to read that poem specifically because I think it has 2 elements that are really consistently important across 6 O'Clock Mine Report as a collection. And one is that we have a lot of discussion of wildlife, particularly birds and flying insects. And the other is that we have a lot of imagery of, I would call it like rundown imagery of old things, of worn things. But it sounds a lot more negative when I say it like that than I necessarily intend it to be. So I was wondering if you could talk about the significance of those sort of themes or those interests, starting with whichever one you prefer.
All right, so if we start with the birds, we start with the wildlife. West Virginia has tons of wildlife, right? So again, it comes back to write what you know. You can hear the bird songs, you can mimic those bird songs and the rhythms and the lines. You know their general patterns, you know how to coexist with them. So that natural landscape has always been fodder for writers. It's not exclusive to Appalachian writing, West Virginia, to Irene McKinney. These are things that we all exploit as writers.
A big thing in American
Right.
poetry, especially, I think. Yeah.
So then it comes down to what kinds of birds, what kinds of critters, what kinds of animals are we looking at here? In this case, in the case of the starling, well, we know that the starling does get a lot of attention in poetry and in writing in general. One of the key components that makes it a different kind of bird is its ability for mimicry, right?
Okay.
So it can transform and it can accommodate, and its songs are complex. And I think that echoes the Appalachian identity. So there is a kind of a complexity there, right? And even the starling itself can mimic sounds it's only heard once. It can mimic natural sounds. It can mimic man-made sounds. So there's a kind of malleability in that. And I think that's also has to be necessary for Appalachian writing and Appalachian identity to continue to exist, especially in the conditions that we're in, right? So even
maybe
now,
even poetry more generally,
and even poetry more generally. So with that kind of, when we were talking earlier about the shift, right? So we have moved away from the labor unions, even though a lot of us still feel very connected to it, even as our governments tear them down. Really, I have feelings about this. And what's happened in West Virginia is because those coal jobs don't really exist anymore. That's a finite resource. It can only go so far. So you can promise that you can bring back coal jobs, but if coal doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. You can't make that happen. You can't magic that, right? So that means those jobs are now at a loss, right? That means we're sinking into poverty. That means that we're sinking into like high opioid addiction and drug use and all of that in the state. And those of us that aren't falling into that have to leave. So there's a lot of displacement there too. But we are still West Virginian. We are still Appalachian, even if we are displaced from our region. And I think that connects back to the starling as well, the kind of malleability. I think what's also significant there with the starling is where it's situated in the poem. It's stuck, right? This is a flying animal, and it can come and go as it pleases. And in some cases, yes, West Virginia can do that. West Virginians can do that. They can leave and they can come back, and in some cases, but there's a lot of, well, we're trapped, we're stuck here, right? And even implicitly within our home structure, within our community structures, there's a kind of responsibility that says, if you leave, you will fail, right? So it almost pigeonholes you. So even as there's a lack of opportunity in the state, we're still expected to have a strong sense of duty to it, right? A strong connection to it, regardless. And so I think it's really important in this poem that the starling is stuck, right? Stuck in the chimney, stuck in the walls. We're given indication that some of it might be by choice because there's nesting. Make the best of a bad situation in some cases.
Yeah.
You've got to reform the usefulness of that space. If it's not going to be used for burning wood and keeping the house warm, then it's going to become a bird's nest, right?
Okay.
If that makes sense. There's another poem in there in Irene McKinney's collection, specifically about there's a bee that comes in, right? There's a bee that comes in. The bee is early, right? It's not spring yet, or it's not supposed to be spring yet until the bee comes, until this particular bee comes. Well, it's shown up early. And then McKinney makes a connection with that when she says, it's here when it's not supposed to be here. And she talks about what she read in the almanac, right? This thing that's written by white guys who dictate, when things are happening.
Who control the weather.
Right, who control the weather. And this bee has defied it. And she's looking at that, and she would think, and she said, I wonder if the bee would feel as I do, as perplexed as I do about this thing. And she would say, she said, inexact, inappropriate was another word. Like, they're not there at the right time. This cyclical pattern that seems to be broken. So you can tell that now McKinney, not necessarily McKinney, but the speaker of the poem, the narrator of the poem, because we really have to be careful about how we identify. Just because there's an I in a poem doesn't mean it's the writer, right?
Yes.
It could be a persona. It is a persona, whether there's truth to it or not. So in that I, that narrator, there's a kind of fracture. We see this sitting on the outskirts, a kind of not quite belonging. And so again, that fractured identity is coming in.
Yeah.
If we're addressing the rundown aspect, right? So there's a lot of disheveled things in McKinney's work here, in the poem. So there's a tattered mail jeep, there's a tattered rundown house, lots of things are broken down, lots of things are in disrepair, but they're still standing.
Yeah.
And I think what is significant about this is that they've been repurposed, right? So just like the chimney doesn't use fire anymore, doesn't dispense smoke, and we're not using it to heat the house, it's now a home for the birds, for the starlings. And we see a lot of other activity happening in this house too. Mm-hmm. That's supposedly run down where McKinney, or the I in the poem, is sitting, right? Where that narrator has come to rest, to be away from it all. There's still a ton of activity. And the fact that the narrator sees this as a kind of garden, there are seeds still being planted, we can expect new growth.
Okay. So I wanted to follow up, because I'm kind of thinking of the rundown aspects, the worn aspects, the old aspects across the whole collection as a very, very much an Appalachian technique, because we see that also in a lot of your poems. Like your poem Portrait of a Hometown is centered on a bridge that's no longer there, but is still this local landmark. So do you think that's just sort of thematically something, or again, even something that connects to that idea of home, like things that are handed down over generations, things that are preserved, not just the physical things, but stories, recipes, what have you. So is that a particularly Appalachian thing?
I think we hang on to memory a lot, maybe a lot more than other regions, and so I think that's probably where all of that comes from. So even though, for example, in my poem, Portrait of a Hometown, I'm talking about the blue bridge that is not blue. It's been replaced by this stone, concrete, very nondescript, not very unique kind of bridge, but the locals still call it the Blue Bridge. Mm-hmm. And it's because we remember that is part of the identity, that's part of the culture, that is the landmark in our mind, whether it seems to be in physical existence or not.
Okay. So I do want to pick up on one more thematic element of this collection, and that's the influence of Emily Dickinson. There's a whole section in the book named for Emily Dickinson, and then there's a couple of other poems that very clearly evoke her work. So why, in your opinion, why Emily Dickinson?
Well, I can tell you why I feel connected to Emily Dickinson, and it's one of McKinney's influences, one of her major influences, just like McKinney is one of my major influences, right? Mm-hmm. So I think those that we connect to is what we start to borrow from, right? We start to identify with. And I think the elements that she most identifies with in terms of Emily Dickinson, and you can see that coming through loudly in that subsection, is this feminist element.
Okay, yeah.
Is even, what's the poem called? Zero?
You can look at the table of contents.
She says zero. She says zero. So that's the poem. She's talking about she will not be seduced by this other person, right? So taking on the form or taking on the persona of Dickinson, she is not going to be seduced by this man, where in that period in time, women are basically given their identity through their married partners, right? You don't really have access to any resources unless you're married, right? Everything is coming from the husband.
Or the father before you're married.
Or the father before. There's some kind of patriarchy in control, right? And she says, no, I'm not buying into this. You can wear your designer clothes, your little cravat, what have you. I'm not really interested in any of that. I will not be seduced by this. I will be cordial. I will meet you halfway. But I'm not going to overindulge you. Mm-hmm. Right? And you can see this even when she opens up the section, and we're not talking about romantic love. She's looking at the only portrait of Emily Dickinson, right? And she's noticing the way that she's holding herself and the way she's choosing to smile, right? There's choice in this.
Yep.
In a time where women don't get a lot of choices, she's making distinctive choices, right? She will not smile more than she intends to. And she will make a funny little quip, and she is amused, but not enough for the photographer, which is fine. So she leaves them wanting more. And I think that there's an element of that in McKinney as well. It's like, oh, okay, well, I'm not gonna conform to these boxes, right? And so there is a kind of masculinity in her writing, I would argue, where we're not really given to these lofty notions or contradictions or anything like that. She's very much plain language. Mm-hmm. Here is what I see and how I see it. She's not going to say the term comestibles. She's going to say food, right? She's not going to go for the lofty. She's going to go for the everyday. Because the poetry should be accessible. The story, the narrative should be accessible because there's a historian element to her work. There's a kind of preservation that comes with this.
Okay.
And I think that is the connection with Dickinson, is this aspect of this aspect of feminism and redefining what that role means. And we can start to see those shifts. So it paves the way for people like me coming forward and saying, okay, now let's really make our voices a lot bigger and a lot stronger, right? Let's let's be a little bit more clear and direct. And I think that gives a lot of women writers and Appalachian writers like me more permission to speak and say things as we see them, because no one's looking anyway.
I want to come back to something you just said, that idea of like plain language and saying things very simply and directly, because alongside that we need to keep in mind that McKinney is still a consummate artist. She's still a consummate poet. And in terms of Emily Dickinson as an influence, there's one poem in there where she's been very, very liberal with the long dashes, the M dashes, which is very much an Emily Dickinson thing. And so for me, that's a particularly, I think that's actually She Says Zero, but I don't remember 100% if that's the one I'm thinking about. But that idea of like blending that sort of directness and that sort of forthrightness with that ability to be very clearly in command of your art, I think is McKinney is clearly a master of that. Absolutely.
And definitely we're seeing craft and content mirroring each other. So when you get those hard dashes, now it can be, I think in some cases, the dash is, we read too much into that dash with Emily Dickinson. Yes, it does have a purpose, but in this case, I think McKinney is using it to, again, express that fracture, right? To say, here's an omission, here's a pause, here's a kind of stifle or a stick and move. So we can see those shifts a little bit more clearly, because now it's coming through in those rhythms, if we read all those dashes.
Okay. The one last question I want to pose to you before we close. You actually got the opportunity to meet Irene McKinney before she passed away. Can you tell us about that meeting?
I was a total idiot. I probably could not have humiliated myself more. So I met her. I wrote this poem. About her, Daily Forecast, and it actually ended up winning an award there at the conference. So it was this conference in a workshop in Southern West Virginia. I met Irene McKinney. She came up behind me. I was smoking a cigarette. I didn't expect it. I was not prepared. Now, being from West Virginia myself, knowing that we don't really like people in our personal space, I tried to sort of stay away to respect that, and I didn't realize how far back I was standing. And when I leaned in to shake her hand, I didn't step in, so I created kind of this duck butt. I had duck butt when I shook her hand. She was very nice about it. She was smiling. She was trying not to giggle, trying not to make me feel like a total asshole. But the organizer of the conference was there. He saw it happen. He turned his back. He was laughing so hard, silently, that his shoulders were shaking. I was with the editor-in-chief of Connotation Press at the time. He did not bother to hide how he was feeling. Instead, he just pointed and laughed at me right on. And all of this is going down with Irene McKinney standing there, and again, she's being a great sport about it, trying to pretend all of this isn't happening. I'm trying to pretend this isn't happening, but I'm fangirling like an idiot. And that's my story. How I made a jackass out of myself in front of Irene McKinney.
All right. Once again, thanks, Andi, for taking the time to talk to us. Thanks, Frank, for interrupting the video several times. All right. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.